The candles in the ballroom burned low, and the air was thick with perfume and heat when Duke Alastair Reburn gripped Lady Evangeline Ashworth's wrist and pulled her behind a marble pillar, away from the swirl of dancers and the bright chatter of London's finest families. "Leave before midnight," he whispered, his voice sharp with urgency, his eyes darting toward the crowd as though searching for someone who might be listening. "Do not question me, just leave." Evangeline stared at him, her breath caught somewhere between shock and confusion. She had known Alastair for 3 years, ever since her family had moved to London from the countryside, and in all that time she had never once heard him speak to her with such intensity. He was a man known for his composure, his cold politeness, his careful distance from every woman who tried to catch his attention at these endless society gatherings. And now here he was, standing so close she could feel the warmth of his breath, his fingers still curled loosely around her wrist, his jaw tight with something that looked almost like fear. "Why?" she managed to ask, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "There is no time to explain," he said. He glanced over his shoulder again, and for a moment Evangeline thought she saw real worry flicker across his face, a crack in the composed mask he always wore. "Please. Trust me on this one thing." Before she could press him further, a group of laughing guests spilled around the pillar, and Alastair released her wrist as though it had burned him. He straightened his coat, gave her a short, formal bow, and walked away into the crowd without another word, leaving her standing alone with her heart pounding and 1,000 questions crowding her mind. Evangeline pressed her hand to the spot where his fingers had been, feeling the ghost of his grip still there. She looked around the ballroom, taking in the familiar sights that suddenly seemed strange and full of hidden danger. Chandeliers dripped golden light over the dancers. Servants moved between the tables with trays of champagne. Somewhere near the far wall, an orchestra played a lively tune, and couples spun across the polished floor in bright silks and dark evening coats. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing looked out of place. And yet Alastair's warning sat in her chest like a stone. She found her friend Charlotte near the refreshment table, fanning herself lazily and watching the dancers with a bored expression. "You look pale," Charlotte said, lowering her fan. "Has someone said something unkind to you?" "No," Evangeline said quickly, though her mind was still spinning. "It is nothing, just the heat." Charlotte did not look convinced, but she let the matter drop, launching instead into a story about a gentleman who had stepped on her hem twice during the last dance. Evangeline nodded along, though she barely heard a word. Her eyes kept drifting across the room, searching for Alastair's tall figure among the crowd, trying to understand what could have frightened a man who never seemed frightened of anything. She told herself it was foolish to take his words seriously. Alastair Reburn was known for being unpredictable in his own quiet way, and perhaps this was simply another one of his strange moods, a passing whim that meant nothing at all. She was a grown woman, not a child to be ordered about by a man who had barely spoken 20 words to her in the past month. If he wished her to leave before midnight, he could at least offer her a reason. And yet, as the evening wore on, she found herself checking the great clock at the far end of the ballroom more often than she would have liked to admit. Each time the hands crept forward, a small knot tightened in her stomach. At 10:30, Lord Julian Marchant approached her, his smile easy and practiced, his bow a touch too elegant. Evangeline had heard whispers about him before, stories of debts left unpaid and friendships ended badly, but he had always been perfectly charming to her, full of clever compliments and light conversation that made the evenings pass more quickly. "Lady Ashworth," he said, extending his hand. "You appear to be the only woman in this room not yet claimed for a dance. I find that a great injustice." Evangeline hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. She glanced once more toward the crowd, hoping to catch sight of Alastair, hoping perhaps for some explanation that never came. He was nowhere to be seen. "I would be glad to dance, Lord Marchant," she said, forcing a smile onto her face. They moved on to the floor together, and for a while Evangeline allowed herself to forget the strange warning that had unsettled her earlier. Julian was a skilled dancer, guiding her easily through the steps, filling the silence between them with light jokes about the other guests and stories from his recent travels. He had a way of making her laugh despite herself, and for the length of one dance, the tension in her chest eased. But as the music ended and the dancers began to change partners, Julian did not release her hand. "Walk with me," he said, his voice dropping to something quieter, more private. "It is far too warm in here, and I would like a moment of your company away from all these prying eyes." Evangeline glanced around the ballroom. No one seemed to be paying them any particular attention. The idea of stepping away from the noise and heat, if only for a few minutes, was tempting, and she told herself there was no harm in it. She was, after all, a grown woman capable of making her own decisions, capable of walking a short distance with a gentleman she had known for months without needing anyone's permission. She nodded, and Julian led her through a set of tall doors into a smaller adjoining room, one used for card games earlier in the evening but now mostly empty, lit only by a few candles and the moonlight spilling through the tall windows. The music from the ballroom drifted in faintly, muffled by distance and the closed doors. "This is better," Julian said, releasing her hand at last and turning to face her with a warm smile. "Do you not agree the crowds can be exhausting?" "I suppose so," Evangeline said, though she felt a small prickle of unease settle over her, the same unease that had followed her since Alastair's whispered warning. She glanced toward the doors, half expecting someone to appear and interrupt them, though no one did. Julian moved closer, offering his hand once more. "One more dance," he said softly. "Just the two of us. No crowds, no prying eyes, only the music." Evangeline hesitated. There was something in his tone that felt different from before, something a touch too eager, too insistent. But she reminded herself that Julian had never given her any real reason to distrust him, and refusing now would seem strange, perhaps even rude. She placed her hand in his once more, and they began to move slowly to the faint music drifting in from the other room, alone in the candle-lit space, their steps echoing softly against the polished floor. She did not know, as she danced, that the tall doors at the far end of the room had opened without a sound, or that a pair of familiar eyes had found her there, alone with Julian Marchant, in a room meant to be empty. Duke Alastair Reburn stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still resting on the handle, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He had returned to the ballroom only to make certain that Evangeline had left as he asked, only to ease the fear that had gripped him since he first overheard the conversation that sent him rushing to find her earlier that evening. He had expected to find her safely gone, perhaps already in her carriage, perhaps already halfway home. Instead, he found her here, laughing softly at something Julian Marchant had said, turning gracefully in his arms as though she had not a single care in the world, as though his warning had meant nothing to her at all. Something tightened painfully in Alastair's chest, a feeling he did not have a name for, sharp and sudden and impossible to ignore. He told himself it was simple worry, nothing more, the natural concern of a man who had tried to protect someone and failed. But even as he thought it, he knew it was not the whole truth. He remained in the doorway a moment longer, watching the candlelight catch in Evangeline's hair, watching the easy way she moved with Julian, before he stepped back into the shadow of the hallway without a sound, his warning unspoken, his fear unresolved, and something else entirely rising in its place, something that felt dangerously close to jealousy. Behind him, the music continued to play, soft and unaware, while in the small candle-lit room, Evangeline danced on, unknowing that the very man who had begged her to leave was now standing just beyond the door, his heart in turmoil, his mind racing toward conclusions that would change everything between them before the night was through. Alastair walked quickly through the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the stone floor, his thoughts a storm he could not calm. He had spent the better part of the evening trying to shield her from a danger she did not even know existed, and now he wondered if his effort had been wasted, if perhaps she had never believed him at all. He paused near a tall window overlooking the dark gardens, gripping the sill until his knuckles whitened, and forced himself to breathe. He reminded himself, as he had done many times before, that his concern for Evangeline Ashworth was born of duty and nothing more, that a man in his position had a responsibility to protect those under threat, regardless of his own feelings. But even as he told himself this, the image of her laughing softly in Julian Marchant's arms refused to leave his mind, sharp and unwelcome, stirring something he had long tried to bury. Down the hall, a clock began to chime the half-hour, and Alistair straightened, forcing his expression back into the calm mask society expected of him. There would be time enough later to make sense of what he felt. For now, there was still a danger circling Evangeline that she did not understand, and whether she trusted him or not, he intended to make certain she survived the night unharmed. He turned back toward the ballroom, his jaw set, his resolve hardening with every step, unaware that the true test of his warning and of everything left unspoken between them had only just begun. The dance ended, and Julian Marchant did not step back right away. He held Evangeline's hand a moment longer than propriety allowed, his thumb brushing lightly against her knuckles, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how alone they truly were. The candles had burned lower still, and the muffled music from the ballroom seemed farther away than before, as though the two of them had drifted into some quiet pocket of the night that belonged only to themselves. "You dance beautifully, Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice low. "I confess I have been hoping for a private moment with you all evening." Evangeline gently withdrew her hand, offering a polite smile to soften the movement. "You flatter me, Lord Marchant, but I think we should return to the others. My absence will be noticed." "Let them notice," Julian said, a small laugh escaping him, though his eyes remained fixed on her. "Is it truly so terrible to wish for a few moments away from the crowd? I only wanted to speak with you honestly, without an audience listening to every word." Evangeline felt a flicker of unease return, sharper now than before. She thought again of Alistair's warning, of the fear she had seen flash across his face, and wondered, not for the first time that evening, whether there had been more truth in his words than she had allowed herself to believe. She glanced toward the door, half hoping someone might appear, half dreading what such an appearance might mean for her reputation should anyone find her alone with Julian in a near-empty room. "Speak honestly, then," she said, keeping her voice steady, "but let us do so as we walk back toward the ballroom." Julian's smile faltered only slightly before returning, smooth as ever. "As you wish." They walked together toward the doors, and as they went, Julian filled the silence with easy conversation, praising her gown, asking after her family's estate in the countryside, mentioning plans for a hunting party he hoped she might attend. Evangeline answered politely, though her mind was elsewhere, turning over the strange events of the evening, trying to piece together what any of it could mean. When they re-entered the ballroom, the warmth and noise struck her like a wave, and for a moment she felt almost dizzy with relief at rejoining the crowd. She excused herself from Julian as gracefully as she could, claiming a need to find her aunt, and slipped away into the safety of familiar faces. She found Charlotte near the same refreshment table as before, now deep in conversation with two other young ladies about an upcoming wedding. Evangeline hovered nearby, only half listening, her eyes scanning the room once more for any sign of Alistair. She spotted him eventually, standing near one of the tall windows, speaking quietly with an older gentleman she did not recognize. His expression was composed, distant, giving nothing away, and yet something in the set of his shoulders told her he was not truly listening to whatever the older man was saying. She wanted, quite suddenly, to go to him, to ask him plainly what had frightened him earlier, why he had vanished so quickly after his warning, and why he had returned looking so troubled now. But something held her back, a strange nervousness she could not name, and instead she remained where she was, watching him from across the room, until Charlotte's voice pulled her back into the conversation at hand. The evening wore on. Evangeline danced twice more, once with a pleasant young baron who spoke almost entirely about horses, and once with her cousin's husband, a kind man who noticed her distraction and gently teased her about it until she laughed despite herself. Slowly, the tension in her chest began to ease, and she allowed herself to believe, if only for a while, that perhaps Alistair's warning had simply been a misunderstanding, or a joke gone too far. It was nearly 11 when she noticed Julian watching her again from across the room, his gaze steady and unreadable. He did not approach her a second time, but something in the way he looked at her sent a small chill down her spine, though she could not say exactly why. She turned away, focusing instead on the conversation beside her, determined not to let her imagination run wild over nothing. As midnight approached, the orchestra began preparing for one final dance before the ball would draw to a close, and the room buzzed with a fresh wave of energy, guests hurrying to find partners for the last set. Evangeline stood near the edge of the floor, unsure whether to join in or begin gathering her things to leave, Alastair's warning suddenly loud in her mind once more. She turned, searching for him again, and found him already watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable but his eyes locked firmly on hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the noise and light of the ballroom fading into the background as though it were only the two of them standing there. Evangeline felt her heart quicken, though whether from nerves or something else entirely, she could not have said. Then Julian appeared at her side once more, offering his hand for the final dance, and the spell was broken. She hesitated, glancing once more toward Alastair, but he had already turned away, his jaw tight, his shoulders stiff, walking toward the doors that led out of the ballroom without so much as a backward glance. Something in Evangeline's chest sank at the sight, though she could not explain why his leaving should affect her so deeply. She accepted Julian's hand out of habit more than desire, allowing him to lead her onto the floor for the last dance of the evening, her mind only half present, her thoughts trailing after the Duke who had vanished into the night. As the music began, slow and sweeping, Julian drew her closer than the dance strictly required, his hand firm against her waist, his voice dropping to a murmur meant only for her ears. "You seem troubled tonight, Lady Ashworth," he said. "Is something weighing on your mind?" "It is nothing," Evangeline replied automatically, though the lie felt heavier than usual on her tongue. "I hope you know," Julian continued, his tone shifting into something softer, almost tender, "that you may always trust me. Whatever troubles you, whatever concerns you carry, I would be glad to help however I am able." Evangeline studied his face for a moment, searching for sincerity, and found what appeared to be genuine warmth in his expression. And yet, beneath it, she could not shake the feeling that something did not quite fit, some small detail out of place that she could not identify. "That is very kind of you," she said carefully, "though I assure you there is nothing so serious as to require your assistance." Julian smiled, though it did not entirely reach his eyes. "Of course. Forgive me for prying." They finished the dance in comfortable enough silence, and when the music ended, Julian bowed and thanked her graciously before excusing himself to speak with another group of guests. Evangeline watched him go, relief mixing with a lingering unease she could not fully shake. The great clock at the far end of the room struck the first chime of midnight just as she turned to look for her aunt among the thinning crowd. Around her, guests began calling for their carriages, gathering shawls and gloves, exchanging final farewells before the long night drew to its close. Evangeline felt the weight of Alastair's warning settle over her once more, heavier now that midnight had truly arrived, and she wondered with a small shiver whether she had made a grave mistake in choosing to stay. She thought of the way he had looked at her from across the room, the strange mixture of worry and something else entirely in his eyes before he had turned and walked away. She thought of Julian's too warm hand at her waist, his careful questions, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes when he spoke of trust. As she made her way toward the entrance hall to find her aunt and their waiting carriage, Evangeline could not shake the growing certainty that something significant had shifted that evening, something she did not yet fully understand, but that would not stay hidden for long. The warning had been given, midnight had come and gone. And somewhere beneath the glittering surface of the ball, a danger she could not yet name was already closing in around her, drawing nearer with every passing moment, whether she chose to believe it or not. 2 days passed before Evangeline saw Alastair again, and in that time she turned the events of the ball over in her mind so many times that she began to doubt her own memory of them. Had he truly looked so afraid when he warned her? Had she truly seen jealousy in his eyes across the crowded room? The more she replayed the evening, the less certain she became, until she started to wonder if perhaps her imagination had exaggerated the entire affair. She was in the garden behind her family's townhouse, cutting late roses for the drawing room, when her maid announced that the Duke of Reburn had arrived and wished to speak with her. Evangeline's heart gave an unexpected leap, and she smoothed her skirts quickly before making her way inside, telling herself firmly that there was nothing to be nervous about. Alistair was waiting in the small parlor, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture as formal and controlled as ever. When she entered, he turned, and for a brief moment something flickered across his face that looked almost like relief. "Lady Ashworth," he said, bowing slightly, "thank you for seeing me." "Of course," she replied, gesturing toward a chair. "Please sit. Would you care for tea?" "I will not stay long," he said, though he did take the offered seat. "I came only to ask after your welfare. You left the ball rather late the other evening." Evangeline studied him carefully as she settled into the chair across from him. "You noticed the time I left." "I noticed a great many things that evening," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary. She decided, in that moment, that she would not dance around the subject any longer. "Your Grace, I must ask you plainly, why did you tell me to leave before midnight? You gave me no explanation, and I confess I have thought of little else since." Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening as though weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "There have been troubling rumors circulating among certain circles of society, rumors involving a scheme to trap young women of good family into compromising situations that could then be used to force marriage, or worse, to extract money and silence through threats of scandal. I had reason to believe such a scheme might be set in motion at the ball, and I feared you might become a target." Evangeline's breath caught. "A target? Why would anyone target me?" "Your family's fortune is not insignificant," Alistair said carefully, "and you are, forgive my bluntness, unmarried and well regarded. You fit the pattern of those who have been targeted before." She sat back in her chair, trying to absorb this information, her mind racing back to the strange, too warm conversations with Julian Marchant, his insistence on private walks, his lingering touches during their dance. A cold feeling began to spread through her chest. "You believe Lord Marchant is involved in this scheme," she said slowly, watching his face for confirmation. Alistair's expression darkened. "I have reason to suspect him, yes. I do not yet have proof enough to make a public accusation, but the pattern fits too closely to ignore. Which is why, when I saw you dancing alone with him in that private room, I feared the worst." Evangeline felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with indignation. "You saw us." "I did," Alistair admitted, his voice tight. "I had returned to make certain you had left as I asked, and instead I found you with him, alone, exactly as the scheme requires." "Nothing improper occurred," Evangeline said quickly, though even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in. Had anyone else seen them together? Had Julian arranged for witnesses, as Alistair suggested was part of the scheme? "I do not doubt your word," Alistair said, more gently now. "But it does not matter what truly occurred, only what can be claimed to have occurred and by whom. If Marchant intended to use that private moment against you, the damage may already be done, regardless of your innocence." Evangeline pressed a hand to her forehead, the full weight of the situation settling over her. "What am I to do, then?" "For now, nothing," Alistair said. "I do not yet know the full scope of what Marchant intends, or whether he has already set anything in motion. I would ask only that you avoid him as much as possible, and that you tell me immediately if he attempts to contact you or arrange another private meeting." "You still have not told me why," Evangeline said quietly. "Why you took such care to warn me in the first place, above all the other women at that ball." Alistair's composure slipped, just slightly, and for a moment she saw something raw beneath his careful expression, something he seemed to be fighting to keep contained. "Does it matter why?" "It matters to me," she said softly. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to his hands before lifting again to meet hers. "I have watched you for some time, Lady Ashworth, longer than perhaps I should admit. When I heard whispers of this scheme, and understood that you might be among those considered, I found I could not simply stand by and do nothing. Whatever else may be said of me, I could not bear the thought of harm coming to you." Evangeline's heart pounded at his words, warmth spreading through her chest despite the seriousness of their conversation. She had not expected such honesty from him, not after years of careful distance and cool politeness. "Alistair," she began, using his given name without quite meaning to, "I do not know what to say." "You need not say anything," he said quickly, rising from his chair as though suddenly uncomfortable with how much he had revealed. "I have said what I came to say. Please be careful. Avoid Marchant if you can. And send word to me if you notice anything strange, anything at all." "I will," she promised, standing as well. He bowed once more, formal again, though his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than the gesture required. "Good day, Lady Ashworth." "Good day, Your Grace," she replied, watching him leave, her mind spinning with everything he had told her. After he had gone, Evangeline remained standing in the parlor for a long while, staring out the window at the garden beyond, her thoughts a tangle of fear and something warmer, something she was not yet ready to name. She thought of Julian Marchant's easy smiles, his careful questions, the way he had drawn her into that private room with such practiced charm. Had it truly been part of some larger scheme? Had she been foolish enough to walk directly into danger without realizing it? She thought, too, of Alistair, of the fear in his voice when he warned her, the jealousy she now understood she had truly seen across the ballroom, the raw honesty in his admission that he had watched her, that he could not bear the thought of harm coming to her. Something had shifted between them in this conversation, something that went beyond mere duty or concern, and Evangeline found herself both thrilled and terrified by the possibility of what it might mean. That evening, as she prepared for bed, her maid brought her a letter that had arrived by messenger, sealed with wax and addressed in an elegant hand she did not immediately recognize. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper, her stomach tightening as she read the words within. The letter was from Julian Marchant. He wrote warmly, thanking her for the pleasure of her company at the ball, and expressing his hope that she might join him for a private walk in the park the following afternoon, insisting he had matters of importance to discuss with her, matters he could not commit fully to paper. Evangeline read the letter twice, her heart pounding, Alistair's warning ringing loudly in her mind. She knew without question that she should refuse, that she should send word to Alistair immediately and avoid Julian entirely as she had been advised. And yet some part of her, the same stubborn part that had kept her at the ball past midnight in defiance of a warning she did not yet understand, wondered if there was not some way to use this invitation to her advantage, to learn more about what Julian truly intended, to help uncover the truth of the scheme Alistair suspected. She sat at her writing desk for a long while, the letter open before her, torn between caution and curiosity, unaware that her decision that night would set in motion events far more dangerous than she could possibly imagine, drawing her deeper into a web of deception that had already claimed more victims than she knew, and that would soon threaten not only her reputation, but perhaps her very safety as well. Outside, the night had grown quiet and still, the London streets settling into darkness, while somewhere across the city, in a study lit only by a single candle, Julian Marchant sat reviewing a list of names, Evangeline's among them, his expression calm and calculating, already planning his next move with the careful patience of a man who had done this many times before, and who did not intend to fail now. Evangeline did not sleep well that night. She lay awake for hours, staring at the shadows on her ceiling, turning the letter's words over and over in her mind until they blurred together into a single question. Should she go to Julian, or should she send word to Alistair first and let him decide what to do? By morning she had made her choice, though it was not one she felt entirely confident about. She would go to the park as Julian had asked, but she would not go unprepared, and she would not go without first telling Alistair of her plan, whatever his objections might be. She sent a short note to Reburn House shortly after breakfast, explaining Julian's invitation and her intention to meet him, though she softened the truth slightly, framing it as an opportunity to learn more rather than admitting the full extent of her curiosity. Within the hour, a reply arrived, written in a hand that betrayed obvious agitation despite its careful formality. Alistair's note was brief and direct. He forbade her from going alone, insisted that meeting Marchant under any circumstances was far too dangerous given what he suspected, and asked that she wait for him to call on her before making any further decisions. Evangeline read the note twice, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the situation. There was something almost endearing in his obvious worry, even wrapped as it was in stiff, formal language. He arrived within the hour, his expression tense as he was shown into the parlor once more. "You cannot go," he said, without preamble, before she had even finished rising to greet him. "It is far too dangerous. If Marchant suspects for even a moment that you are aware of his intentions, there is no telling what he might do." "I do not intend to accuse him of anything," Evangeline said calmly, though her pulse quickened at his obvious concern. "I intend only to meet him as planned, to behave exactly as I would have before any of this came to light, and to see what he truly wants from me. Perhaps in doing so, we might learn something useful." "Or perhaps you place yourself directly in harm's way," Alistair countered, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. "Evangeline, please. I am asking you, not as a duke exercising authority, but as someone who cares deeply for your safety, to trust me on this matter." The use of her given name, so informal and unexpected, sent a small thrill through her chest despite the tension of the conversation. "I do trust you," she said softly, "but I also believe I am capable of protecting myself, provided I am not entirely alone." Alistair studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options, his jaw tight with reluctant consideration. "If you insist on going," he said finally, "then I will accompany you, at a distance close enough to intervene should anything go wrong, but far enough that Marchant will not suspect my presence." Evangeline considered this proposal, and found it reasonable enough to ease some of her own worry. "Very well. I will send word accepting his invitation, and you may follow at whatever distance you deem necessary." The following afternoon, Evangeline dressed carefully for her meeting with Julian, choosing a modest walking gown and instructing her maid to accompany her only as far as the park entrance, where she would wait nearby while Evangeline walked with Julian along the more populated paths, careful to remain always within sight of other visitors enjoying the pleasant weather. Julian was waiting for her near the fountain when she arrived, dressed impeccably as always, his smile warm and welcoming as he bowed over her hand. "Lady Ashworth, thank you for coming. I was uncertain whether you would accept my invitation." "I confess I was uncertain myself," Evangeline admitted, keeping her tone light despite the tension coiled tightly in her chest. "But you mentioned matters of importance, and I found my curiosity too strong to resist." They began walking slowly along the path, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders, other couples and families strolling nearby, offering Evangeline a small measure of comfort in the knowledge that she was not truly alone with him, whatever privacy their conversation might otherwise suggest. "I wish to speak with you," Julian began, his tone growing more serious, "because I have noticed a certain distance in your manner since the ball, and I find myself concerned that I may have said or done something to trouble you." Evangeline chose her words carefully, aware of how much depended on maintaining her composure. "I assure you, Lord Marchant, nothing troubles me beyond the ordinary demands of the season." "I am glad to hear it," he said, though his eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her wonder if he believed her at all. "I will admit I have grown rather fond of your company these past months, and I would hate to think anything had come between us." "There is nothing between us to speak of," Evangeline said, aiming for lightness, beyond a pleasant friendship formed over the course of the season. Julian's expression flickered, something calculating passing briefly across his features before he smoothed it away with practiced ease. Of course, forgive my forwardness. I only hoped that perhaps in time our friendship might grow into something more. Evangeline felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun, uncertain whether his words were genuine affection or simply another layer of his careful scheme. She glanced discreetly toward the edge of the park, catching sight of a tall figure standing near a distant tree, unmistakably Alistair, watching over her from exactly the distance he had promised, his presence offering her a small measure of courage. "You flatter me, Lord Marchant," she said carefully, "but I think it best we continue simply as friends for the time being. I am not yet ready to consider anything more serious." Julian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, though he recovered quickly, nodding as though her answer had not troubled him in the slightest. "Of course, I understand entirely. Perhaps I have simply grown impatient, hoping to secure your favor before some other gentleman does." They continued their walk for a while longer, Julian steering the conversation toward safer topics, discussing the upcoming season's events, a new play recently opened in the theater district, mutual acquaintances, and their various pursuits. Evangeline played her part carefully, offering polite responses while remaining alert to any sign that might confirm Alistair's suspicions. It was only as they neared the end of their walk, approaching the fountain once more where they had begun, that Julian's demeanor shifted slightly, his voice dropping into something more pointed. "I do hope, Lady Ashworth," he said, watching her closely, "that whatever the Duke of Reburn may have said to you, you will not allow it to color your judgment of me unfairly. I have heard he has taken a particular interest in your affairs of late." Evangeline's heart skipped, alarm flashing through her chest at how directly he had raised the subject. "I am not certain what you mean," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "Only that Reburn has a certain reputation for meddling in matters that do not concern him," Julian continued, his tone still light but his eyes sharp. "I would hate for his interference to cause any unnecessary distance between us." "His Grace and I are simply acquainted," Evangeline said carefully, "as we have been for several years. I hardly think his opinions influence my own judgment in any particular direction." Julian studied her a moment longer as though testing the truth of her words before his smile returned, easy and warm once more. "Of course, forgive me, I did not mean to suggest otherwise." They said their farewells shortly after, Julian bowing over her hand once more, his lips lingering perhaps a moment too long against her gloved fingers before he released her, promising to call on her again soon. Evangeline watched him walk away, her pulse still racing, before turning to find Alistair approaching from the edge of the park, his expression tight with barely restrained tension. "What did he say to you?" Alistair asked, falling into step beside her as they made their way toward her waiting carriage. "He mentioned you," Evangeline said quietly. "He seemed to know that you had spoken with me, and he seemed eager to ensure your influence would not turn me against him." Alistair's jaw tightened. "That confirms what I feared. He is watching closely, perhaps more closely than I had realized. We must be careful from here forward, Evangeline. Every step must be considered." "I understand," she said, though a small thrill ran through her at the way he spoke her name so easily now, without the formal titles that had governed their conversations for so long. "What do we do next?" Alistair was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant as he considered the question. "I believe it is time to seek help from someone who may know more of Marchant's dealings than either of us currently do. There is a woman, a widow of my acquaintance, who has long moved in the same circles as Marchant, and who may have insight into the true nature of his activities." "Then we should speak with her as soon as possible," Evangeline said firmly, determination steadying her voice despite the fear still coiled in her chest. Alistair nodded, his expression softening slightly as he looked at her, something warm and unguarded passing briefly across his features before he caught himself and looked away. "I will arrange it for tomorrow if she is willing to receive us." Until then, please be cautious. Marchant is more dangerous than he appears, and I fear we have only begun to understand the full extent of what he intends." As they reached her carriage and said their farewells, Evangeline found herself watching Alistair walk away with a new awareness she had not felt before, a growing certainty that whatever danger lay ahead, she no longer faced it alone, and that the man who had once seemed so distant and unreadable had become, in the span of only a few short days, someone she trusted more deeply than she could have imagined possible. The following afternoon, Alistair's carriage arrived promptly to collect Evangeline, and together they traveled across the city to a modest but elegant townhouse belonging to Lady Margaret Pemberton, a widow whose late husband had once been close friends with Alistair's father. Evangeline had heard the name in passing before, though she had never met the woman personally, and she found herself curious about what insight this stranger might offer into the mystery surrounding Julian Marchant. Lady Pemberton received them in a comfortable sitting room lined with books and framed portraits, her manner warm but sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who missed very little of what happened around her. She was perhaps 50 years of age, dressed simply but elegantly, with silver threading through her dark hair and an intelligence in her gaze that Evangeline found immediately reassuring. "Alistair," she said, rising to greet them both, "it has been far too long, and this must be Lady Ashworth of whom I have heard so much." Evangeline glanced at Alistair, surprised, though he offered no explanation, simply bowing formally and gesturing for her to take a seat. "Margaret, thank you for receiving us on such short notice," he said. "I would not have imposed if the matter were not urgent." "Your note suggested as much," Lady Pemberton said, settling back into her own chair and studying them both carefully. "You wish to speak of Julian Marchant, I believe." "You know something of him?" Evangeline asked, unable to hide her eagerness. Lady Pemberton's expression grew serious, the warmth in her eyes cooling into something more guarded. "I know a great deal, unfortunately, though it has taken me some time to piece together the truth of it. Tell me first, what has brought you both to my door with such urgency?" Alistair recounted the events of the ball, his warning to Evangeline, the private dance with Marchant, and the subsequent meeting in the park, while Evangeline added her own observations where relevant, describing Julian's careful questions and his obvious awareness of Alistair's involvement. Lady Pemberton listened without interrupting, her expression growing steadily more troubled as the story unfolded. "I feared as much," she said finally, once they had finished. "You are not the first to come to me with such concerns, though I confess I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Marchant might have abandoned his schemes after the trouble with Miss Alderton last season." "Miss Alderton," Evangeline repeated, the name unfamiliar to her. "A young woman much like yourself," Lady Pemberton said quietly, "well regarded, with a considerable inheritance from her mother's side of the family. Marchant courted her much as he appears to be courting you now, with careful attention and practiced charm, until he arranged a private meeting much like the one described to me just now, at a gathering not unlike the ball you attended. He ensured witnesses were present, though not obviously so, individuals who could later attest to having seen the two of them alone together under circumstances that could easily be misconstrued as improper." Evangeline felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "What happened to her?" "He approached her family shortly afterward, suggesting that unless a marriage was quickly arranged, or unless a significant sum was paid to ensure certain witnesses remained silent, her reputation would be irreparably damaged," Lady Pemberton continued, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Her family, desperate to avoid scandal, paid him a considerable sum to keep the matter quiet, and Marchant walked away with both his reputation and his pockets intact, while Miss Alderton was left to nurse the wound of having been so thoroughly deceived." "This is precisely what I feared," Alistair said grimly, turning to Evangeline. "You see now why I was so insistent that you leave before midnight, and why I have been so concerned since discovering you alone with him in that room." "But nothing improper occurred between us," Evangeline said, though she heard the note of uncertainty creeping into her own voice. "Surely that must count for something." It matters little what truly occurred, Lady Pemberton said gently, if witnesses can be produced who claim otherwise, or if the mere fact of your privacy together is enough to raise questions in the minds of society. Marchant understands this perfectly, and he has built his entire scheme around exploiting exactly this weakness in how reputation and rumor operate among our circles. Evangeline sat back, the full weight of the danger she faced settling over her at last, no longer an abstract warning but a concrete and terrifying reality. Then I have already placed myself in danger, simply by dancing with him that first evening, and by meeting him again yesterday in the park. Perhaps, Lady Pemberton admitted, though it is not yet too late to act, provided we move carefully and quickly. Marchant typically waits some weeks before making his true demands known, allowing suspicion and rumor to build naturally before he steps forward to offer his supposed discretion in exchange for payment or marriage. If we can gather sufficient proof of his scheme before he moves against you, we may be able to expose him publicly and prevent any harm from coming to your reputation at all. What kind of proof would we need? Alastair asked, leaning forward with renewed intensity. Lady Pemberton considered the question carefully. Testimony from previous victims would be invaluable, though many are understandably reluctant to come forward, fearing further damage to their own reputations. Documentation of any payments made to Marchant or his associates would also prove useful, though such records are notoriously difficult to obtain given how carefully he conducts his affairs. And of course, if we could catch him in the act of arranging such a scheme, with reliable witnesses present to confirm his intentions, that would provide the strongest evidence of all. Miss Alderton, Evangeline said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. Might she be willing to speak with us if approached carefully? Surely she would wish to see Marchant's scheme exposed, if only to prevent others from suffering as she did. Lady Pemberton considered this for a long moment. It is possible. She has largely withdrawn from society since the incident, though I understand she has recently become engaged to a kind gentleman who knows nothing of what transpired. She may fear that coming forward now would jeopardize that engagement, but she may also feel a strong desire to see justice done, particularly if approached with sensitivity and discretion. I could write to her, Evangeline offered. Perhaps a letter, carefully worded, expressing sympathy rather than accusation, might encourage her to trust us with her story. That seems wise, Alastair agreed, though his expression remained troubled. Margaret, is there anything else you can tell us that might help us understand the scope of what we are dealing with? How many others has he targeted, to your knowledge? Lady Pemberton's expression grew grave. I know of at least 3 others beyond Miss Alderton, though I suspect the true number may be higher, given how carefully Marchant conceals his activities and how reluctant his victims have been to speak openly of their experiences. He has grown quite skilled at this over the years, refining his methods, choosing his targets carefully, always ensuring he maintains enough plausible deniability that no direct accusation could ever be proven against him without substantial evidence. Then we must gather that evidence, Evangeline said firmly, determination steadying her voice despite the fear still coursing through her. Whatever it takes, however long it may require, I will not allow him to harm anyone else as he has harmed these women, nor will I allow him to threaten my own family's reputation without a fight. Alastair looked at her with something close to admiration, his earlier concern softening into something warmer, more approving. Your courage does you credit, Evangeline, but we must proceed carefully. Marchant is dangerous precisely because he is patient and calculating. If he suspects for even a moment that we are working against him, he may accelerate his plans, or worse, take steps to protect himself that could prove genuinely harmful to you or to others involved. I understand the risk, Evangeline said, meeting his eyes steadily. But I would rather face that risk directly than wait helplessly for whatever he intends to happen to me. Lady Pemberton watched the exchange between them with quiet interest, a small knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth despite the seriousness of their conversation. You two make a formidable pair, she observed. I have not seen Alastair so animated in defense of anyone's interests in quite some time. Alastair's cheeks colored slightly at this observation, and he cleared his throat, steering the conversation firmly back toward practical matters. "Margaret, might you help us arrange a meeting with Miss Alderton, and perhaps with the other women you mentioned as well? We will need to move carefully, but time is not entirely on our side." "I will do what I can," Lady Pemberton promised. "Though I must caution you both, this will not be a simple matter. These women have suffered greatly, and their trust will not be easily won. You must approach them with patience and genuine compassion, not merely as pieces in a larger scheme to expose Marchant." "Of course," Evangeline said quickly, "I have no wish to cause them further pain. I only hope to help them find some measure of justice, while also protecting myself and any others who might yet fall victim to his schemes." They spent another hour discussing possible strategies, Lady Pemberton offering what guidance she could based on her own knowledge of Marchant's circles and connections, before Alastair and Evangeline finally took their leave, promising to remain in close contact as their plans developed further. As they rode together in his carriage back toward her family's townhouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the window, Evangeline found herself studying Alastair's profile, the tension still visible in the set of his jaw, the careful way he watched the streets outside as though danger might emerge from any direction at any moment. "You have been carrying this burden alone for some time, haven't you?" she asked quietly. "Trying to protect women you barely knew from a danger most of society refuses to acknowledge even exists." Alastair was quiet for a moment before answering, his eyes still fixed on the passing streets. "I first learned of Marchant's activities nearly a year ago, through a chance conversation with a friend whose sister had narrowly avoided becoming one of his victims. Since then, I have tried, quietly and carefully, to warn those I believed might be at risk, though I have had little success in gathering the kind of proof needed to stop him entirely." "And yet you have continued trying, despite the difficulty," Evangeline said softly. "I could not simply stand by," he said, turning at last to meet her gaze, something raw and honest visible in his expression. "Not when I understood the harm he was capable of causing, and certainly not once I realized you might become his next target." Evangeline's heart quickened at the intensity in his voice, the unspoken meaning beneath his careful words. "Alastair," she began softly, "I want you to know how grateful I am, not only for your warning, but for everything you have done since to help protect me." "You need not thank me," he said, though the warmth in his eyes suggested her words had affected him deeply. "I would do far more than this, Evangeline, if it meant keeping you safe." The carriage fell into a comfortable silence as it continued through the streets of London, the weight of their shared purpose settling over them both, drawing them closer together even as the danger surrounding them grew more pressing with each passing hour. Neither spoke of the feelings clearly building between them, unspoken and unacknowledged, but present nonetheless in every careful glance, every moment of quiet understanding that passed between them as the carriage carried them onward through the fading light of the afternoon, toward a confrontation neither of them could yet fully imagine, but that both knew with growing certainty was drawing steadily nearer. A week passed in careful, quiet effort. Evangeline wrote her letter to Miss Alderton, choosing her words with great care, expressing sympathy and understanding rather than judgment, and asking gently whether the young woman might be willing to meet with her in strictest confidence. The reply, when it finally arrived, was hesitant but not entirely discouraging, and within days a meeting was arranged at Lady Pemberton's townhouse, where privacy could be more easily guaranteed. Miss Alderton proved to be a soft-spoken young woman with tired eyes that spoke of hardship carefully hidden beneath a composed exterior. She sat stiffly at first, clearly uncomfortable revisiting painful memories, but as Evangeline spoke gently of her own encounters with Marchant, of the fear and confusion his careful manipulations had caused, something in Miss Alderton's guarded expression began to soften. "I never told anyone the full truth of what happened," Miss Alderton admitted quietly, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "My family paid him what he demanded, and we agreed never to speak of it again, for fear of what further damage might come from the scandal becoming public knowledge." I understand your fear, Evangeline said gently. But if we do not find a way to stop him, he will continue to harm others as he harmed you. I do not ask you to expose yourself to further scandal, only to help us understand his methods well enough that we might catch him before he can harm anyone else. Miss Alderton was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with old fears and fresh hope in equal measure. What would you need from me? Details, Alastair said, speaking for the first time since the conversation had begun, his tone gentle despite the seriousness of the request. How he approached you, how the private meeting was arranged, who else may have been present or aware of what occurred, and precisely how he made his demands known afterward. Any detail, however small, might help us anticipate his methods before he can use them against Lady Ashworth. Slowly, carefully, Miss Alderton began to recount her experience, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, as though the simple act of finally sharing her story after so long carrying it alone offered some measure of relief despite the pain involved. She described how Marchant had courted her attention over several weeks, how he had arranged a seemingly innocent private conversation during a garden party, ensuring that two of his associates observed them from a discreet distance without her knowledge, and how, weeks later, he had approached her father with a carefully worded threat disguised as a reluctant confession of concern for her reputation. He never threatened outright, Miss Alderton explained. He always framed it as though he were trying to protect me, expressing regret that others had seen us together and might draw the wrong conclusions, suggesting that a quiet payment to certain individuals might ensure their continued silence. It felt almost as though he were doing us a favor, even as he extracted a considerable sum from my father. Evangeline listened with growing horror, recognizing uncomfortable echoes of her own recent encounters with Julian in every detail Miss Alderton described. The careful private meeting, the practiced charm, the subtle mention of witnesses whose silence might need to be purchased. It matched precisely the pattern Alastair and Lady Pemberton had described. "Do you know the names of these associates he mentioned?" Alastair asked carefully. "The witnesses he claimed had observed you together." Miss Alderton hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Two names were mentioned, though I never met either individual myself. A Mr. Cartwright and a Mrs. Fenwick, both apparently well regarded within certain social circles, lending credibility to whatever claims Marchant intended to make." Alastair's expression sharpened with recognition. "I know of both individuals. Cartwright in particular has a reputation for financial difficulties that Marchant may well have exploited to secure his cooperation. This is useful information, Miss Alderton. Thank you for trusting us with it." Over the following days, Lady Pemberton arranged 2 more careful meetings with women who had similarly fallen victim to Marchant's schemes, each conversation adding further detail to the pattern Alastair and Evangeline were slowly piecing together. A picture began to emerge of a carefully orchestrated operation, involving not only Marchant himself, but a small network of associates who helped stage compromising situations and later served as false witnesses to support his claims. Evangeline found herself growing increasingly anxious as the investigation progressed, aware that each passing day brought them closer to whatever moment Marchant intended to make his own demands known regarding their private meeting in the park and their earlier private dance at the ball. She had received 2 more letters from him since their meeting, each one warmer and more insistent than the last, expressing his growing affection and hinting at hopes for a more serious understanding between them. "He is preparing his approach," Alastair said grimly one evening, as they reviewed the latest letter together in her family's parlor. "This warmth, this talk of affection and understanding, it is meant to soften you toward accepting whatever demand he ultimately intends to make, whether that demand be marriage or something else entirely." "How much longer do you think we have before he acts?" Evangeline asked, unable to fully mask the fear creeping into her voice. "I cannot say for certain," Alastair admitted. "Based on the pattern described by Miss Alderton and the others, it typically takes several weeks from the initial compromising encounter before he makes his true intentions known. We have perhaps another week, possibly 2, before he moves against you directly." "Then we must move faster," Evangeline said, determination stealing her resolve despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. What else do we need before we can expose him publicly? Alastair considered the question carefully. We have testimony now from 3 separate victims, along with the names of his associates who helped stage these false witness accounts. What we lack still is direct proof, something that would hold weight beyond mere testimony, which skeptical members of society might otherwise dismiss as jealousy or misunderstanding. What kind of proof would satisfy such skepticism? Evangeline asked. Written correspondence, ideally, Alastair said. A letter or document in Marchant's own hand, outlining his demands or acknowledging the scheme directly. Miss Alderton mentioned her father received such correspondence when the demand for payment was finally made. If we could obtain a copy of that letter, or persuade her father to come forward with it directly, it would provide exactly the kind of evidence we need. Evangeline turned this possibility over in her mind. Would Miss Alderton's father be willing to share such evidence, given how carefully he has guarded his daughter's reputation until now? That remains uncertain, Alastair admitted. Though if he understood that coming forward might prevent similar harm from befalling other families, and that his daughter's reputation could be protected through careful handling of the matter, he may be persuaded to help. Lady Pemberton, when consulted the following day, agreed to approach Miss Alderton's father personally, given her long friendship with the family, believing her gentle persuasion might succeed where a more direct approach from strangers might fail. She returned 2 days later with promising news. Mr. Alderton, though initially reluctant, had agreed to share a copy of the letter he had received from Marchant, provided his family's name could be kept out of any public exposure of the scheme, a condition Alastair readily agreed to honor. The letter, when it finally arrived in Alastair's possession, proved damning indeed, containing careful but unmistakable language suggesting that unless a certain sum was paid promptly, unfortunate rumors regarding his daughter's reputation might unfortunately spread beyond his control, phrased with just enough ambiguity to maintain plausible deniability, yet clear enough in its intent to any reasonable reader. This is exactly what we needed, Alastair said, satisfaction evident in his voice as he reviewed the letter alongside Evangeline in his private study, a room she had never before entered but which now felt strangely intimate given the gravity of their shared purpose. Combined with the testimony we have already gathered, this should provide sufficient grounds to expose Marchant's true character before society, and to prevent him from carrying out whatever scheme he intends against you. How do we proceed from here? Evangeline asked, studying the confident set of his shoulders, the quiet determination in his eyes that had become so familiar to her over these past weeks of shared danger and growing trust. I believe the most effective approach would be a public confrontation, carefully staged to ensure Marchant cannot easily deny the accusations or escape the consequences of his actions, Alastair said thoughtfully. Perhaps at a gathering with sufficient witnesses present, individuals of standing and credibility, whose testimony afterward would carry weight regardless of whatever protests Marchant might offer in his own defense. There is a large gathering planned at Lord Ashcombe's estate in a few days' time, Evangeline offered. Nearly all of society will be in attendance. If we intend to confront him publicly, that occasion would offer no shortage of witnesses. Alastair nodded slowly, though concern flickered across his expression. It is a sound plan, though not without risk. Marchant is clever, and cornered men sometimes act unpredictably. We must ensure your safety remains our first priority throughout, whatever confrontation ultimately unfolds. I am not afraid, Evangeline said, though her voice trembled slightly as she spoke the words, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to master. Or rather, I am afraid, but I refuse to let that fear stop me from doing what is right, not only for my own sake, but for Miss Alderton and the others he has harmed. Alastair studied her for a long moment, something fierce and protective visible in his expression. Your courage continues to astonish me, Evangeline. I only wish I could shoulder more of this burden myself, rather than asking you to face such danger. You have already done so much, she said softly, closing the small distance between them without quite realizing she had moved. I could not have uncovered any of this without your help, your warning, your willingness to risk your own reputation in pursuit of justice for women you barely knew. I did not do it for women I barely knew, Alastair said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer seemed able to fully contain. Not entirely. I did it because I could not bear the thought of harm coming to you, Evangeline, and because somewhere along the way, my concern for your safety became something far deeper than simple duty. The air between them grew charged with unspoken feeling, the careful distance they had maintained throughout their weeks of shared investigation suddenly feeling impossibly thin. Evangeline's heart pounded as she looked up at him, searching his face for confirmation of what she thought she saw there, hope and fear tangled together in equal measure. Alastair, she whispered, what exactly are you saying? He hesitated only a moment before reaching out to gently take her hand, his touch warm and steady despite the obvious nervousness beneath his composed exterior. I am saying that I love you, Evangeline, and have for longer than I dared admit even to myself. I understand this may not be the moment for such declarations, given the danger we still face, but I could not bear to face what lies ahead without you knowing the truth of my feelings. Evangeline's breath caught, joy and fear mingling together as the weight of his words settled over her. And though the danger of Marchant's scheme still loomed large and unresolved before them, for one brief, precious moment, nothing else in the world seemed to matter beyond the warmth of his hand around hers, and the certainty, finally spoken aloud, of feelings that had been building steadily between them since that first whispered warning at the ball, feelings that would need to be strong enough in the days ahead to carry them both safely through whatever confrontation still awaited. The evening of Lord Ashcombe's gathering arrived with a strange mixture of dread and determination settling over Evangeline as she dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue that gave her confidence without drawing undue attention. Alastair had called on her earlier that afternoon to review their plan once more, ensuring every detail had been carefully considered before they proceeded with the confrontation that would, one way or another, change the course of the evening entirely. Remember, Alastair said as they stood together in her family's entrance hall, waiting for her aunt to finish preparations for their departure. You need only remain calm and allow me to present the evidence we have gathered. If Marchant attempts to turn the conversation toward accusations against you, do not respond in anger, no matter how tempting it may be. Let the facts speak for themselves. I understand, Evangeline said, though her hands trembled slightly as she pulled on her gloves. I only hope Lord Ashcombe and the other guests will believe what we present, rather than dismissing it as mere gossip or jealousy. Lady Pemberton has agreed to speak as well, lending her considerable credibility to our claims, Alastair reminded her gently. And Miss Alderton's father has consented to confirm the authenticity of the letter, should it become necessary. We have prepared as thoroughly as possible, Evangeline. Now we must simply trust in the strength of the truth itself. The gathering at Lord Ashcombe's estate proved even grander than Evangeline had anticipated, the great hall filled with glittering guests, musicians playing softly near the far wall, servants moving gracefully between clusters of conversation with trays of refreshment. She scanned the crowd carefully as she entered on Alastair's arm, her heart pounding as she searched for Julian's familiar figure among the assembled guests. She spotted him near the center of the room, engaged in easy conversation with a group of young gentlemen, his laugh carrying warmly across the space between them. He noticed her almost immediately, his expression brightening as he excused himself from his companions and made his way toward her. Lady Ashworth, he said, bowing over her hand with his usual practiced elegance, you look radiant this evening. I confess I had hoped to find you here. Lord Marchant, Evangeline replied, forcing calm into her voice despite the tension coiling tightly in her chest. How pleasant to see you again. His gaze flickered toward Alastair, standing protectively at her side, something calculating passing briefly behind his easy smile. Your Grace, I did not realize you and Lady Ashworth had grown so close of late. We share a number of mutual concerns, Alastair said evenly, his tone giving nothing away. Julian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, though he recovered quickly, turning his attention back toward Evangeline. I had hoped we might find a moment to speak privately this evening, Lady Ashworth. There is a matter of some importance I wish to discuss with you. Perhaps we might discuss it here, Evangeline said carefully, glancing toward Alastair for reassurance. Among friends rather than seeking privacy elsewhere. Something shifted behind Julian's eyes, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even alarm, quickly masked beneath his practiced composure. As you wish, though I had hoped for a more discreet setting given the sensitive nature of what I wished to discuss. It was at this moment that Lady Pemberton approached, accompanied by Lord Ashcombe himself, a portly, good-natured gentleman whose expression grew curious as he took in the tense atmosphere surrounding their small gathering. "Is something amiss?" Lord Ashcombe asked, glancing between the assembled group. "There is a matter that requires your attention, my lord," Alastair said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the notice of several nearby guests, exactly as he had planned. "A matter concerning the safety and reputation of several young women within our acquaintance, including Lady Ashworth herself." Julian's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to alarm as understanding dawned. "Reburn, whatever you intend to suggest, I assure you." "I intend to present evidence," Alastair interrupted calmly. "Evidence that you, Lord Marchant, have engaged in a deliberate scheme to compromise the reputations of young women for personal financial gain, arranging seemingly innocent private encounters that are later used to extract payment or force unwanted marriage through threat of scandal." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the nearby guests as Alastair's words carried across the increasingly attentive crowd. Julian's face paled slightly, though he quickly attempted to laugh off the accusation. "This is absurd," he said, forcing lightness into his voice that did not quite mask the tension beneath. "Reburn, I do not know what has prompted such a wild accusation, but I assure you, my lord and all present, that there is no truth whatsoever to these claims." "Then perhaps you would care to explain this letter," Alastair said, withdrawing the document Miss Alderton's father had provided, holding it up for Lord Ashcombe and the gathering crowd to see. "Written in your own hand, addressed to Mr. Alderton, regarding certain unfortunate rumors that might spread unless a sum of money was promptly delivered." Julian's composure cracked visibly at the sight of the letter, his eyes widening with a mixture of fear and fury. "That letter has been taken entirely out of context. I was merely trying to help the family avoid unnecessary scandal, nothing more. By demanding payment in exchange for your silence regarding an encounter you yourself had arranged, with witnesses you yourself had positioned to observe it," Lady Pemberton interjected, her voice sharp with barely restrained anger. "I have spoken personally with 3 women who suffered under this same scheme, Lord Marchant, and their testimony matches this pattern precisely." The crowd around them had grown considerably now, drawn by the rising tension and the scandalous nature of the accusations being leveled so publicly. Lord Ashcombe's expression had grown grave, his earlier good humor entirely replaced by serious concern as he studied the letter Alastair held before him. "Is this true, Marchant?" Lord Ashcombe asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Have you truly been engaged in such a scheme against young women of good family?" "Of course not," Julian said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence, panic beginning to show through his careful mask. "This is nothing more than a jealous attempt by Reburn to discredit me, motivated by his own interest in Lady Ashworth. Surely you can all see the obvious bias in these accusations." "My interest in Lady Ashworth's welfare does not diminish the truth of what has been presented here tonight," Alastair said firmly, though his eyes flickered briefly toward Evangeline, warmth and reassurance passing silently between them despite the tension of the moment. "The letter speaks for itself, as does the testimony we have gathered from your previous victims." At this moment, a new voice joined the growing crowd, and Evangeline turned to see Miss Alderton herself approaching, pale but resolute, accompanied by her father, who had apparently decided to attend despite his earlier reluctance to become publicly involved. "I can confirm the truth of what has been presented," Miss Alderton said, her voice trembling slightly but growing steadier as she spoke, drawing strength perhaps from the presence of her father beside her. "Lord Marchant arranged a private meeting with me at a garden party last season. Insured witnesses observed us together without my knowledge, and later demanded payment from my family to ensure their continued silence regarding what he claimed had occurred between us." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests as Miss Alderton's testimony confirmed the accusations beyond any reasonable doubt. Julian's face had drained entirely of color now, his earlier confidence utterly shattered as he looked around at the crowd of faces, once friendly and welcoming, now regarding him with growing horror and disgust. "This is preposterous," he said weakly, though even his own voice seemed to have lost conviction in the face of such damning evidence presented so publicly. "You cannot possibly believe such wild accusations, based on nothing more than the word of a jealous rival and a bitter young woman seeking to blame others for her own poor judgment." "I believe the evidence speaks clearly enough for itself," Lord Ashcombe said, his voice hardening with obvious anger. "I will not have such conduct associated with my household, Marchant. I suggest you leave immediately, before I am forced to take further action regarding this matter." Julian looked around desperately at the crowd, searching perhaps for some ally who might come to his defense, but found only cold, disapproving stares meeting his gaze from every direction. Whatever charm and easy warmth he had cultivated so carefully over the years had crumbled entirely beneath the weight of the evidence now exposed before all of society's watchful eyes. "You will regret this, Reburn," Julian said quietly, his voice low and dangerous despite his obvious defeat, before turning and pushing his way roughly through the crowd toward the exit, leaving behind a stunned silence that gradually gave way to a rising tide of shocked conversation as the assembled guests began discussing the scandalous revelation that had just unfolded before them. Evangeline felt the tension drain from her shoulders as she watched Julian's retreating figure disappear through the grand doors, replaced by a wave of relief so powerful it left her slightly unsteady on her feet. Alistair was at her side immediately, his hand gentle but firm at her elbow, steadying her. "It is over," he said quietly for her ears alone. "He cannot harm you now, Evangeline. His scheme has been exposed before all of society. Whatever influence he once held has been utterly destroyed." "Thanks to you," Evangeline said, turning to look up at him, gratitude and something warmer shining clearly in her eyes. "And to everyone who was brave enough to come forward and speak the truth tonight." Miss Alderton approached them then, her father close behind, both looking simultaneously exhausted and relieved by the evening's dramatic events. "Thank you, Lady Ashworth," Miss Alderton said softly, "for giving me the courage to finally speak the truth. I have carried this burden alone for far too long." "You are not alone any longer," Evangeline said warmly, taking the young woman's hands in her own. "None of us are, not after tonight." As the crowd continued to buzz with excited conversation around them, processing the scandal that would surely dominate society's attention for weeks to come, Alistair drew Evangeline gently aside, toward a quieter corner of the great hall where they might speak more privately amid the ongoing commotion. "You were remarkably brave tonight," he said softly, his eyes searching her face with obvious admiration. "I know how difficult it must have been to stand before all of society and confront such danger so directly." "I was not alone," Evangeline reminded him gently. "You stood beside me through all of it, from that very first whispered warning at the ball, through every difficult step that followed. I could not have found the courage to face tonight without knowing you were there." Alistair reached out to gently brush a stray curl from her face, his touch tender despite the public setting surrounding them. "Evangeline, after everything we have faced together these past weeks, I find myself more certain than ever of what I told you before. I love you, and I would consider myself the most fortunate man in England if you might one day consider becoming my wife." Evangeline's heart soared at his words. joy overwhelming the last remnants of fear and tension that had gripped her throughout the dramatic confrontation just concluded. "Yes," she whispered, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes despite her best efforts to maintain composure amid the crowded hall. "Yes, Alistair, I would be honored to become your wife." Around them, the great hall continued to buzz with scandal and excitement. But for Evangeline and Alistair, standing together in their quiet corner, nothing else in the world mattered beyond the promise now sealed between them. A promise born from danger and fear, but destined to bloom into something far more lasting and true than either of them could have imagined possible when this remarkable evening had first begun. News of Julian Marchant's disgrace spread through London society, with remarkable speed in the days that followed the gathering at Lord Ashcombe's estate. Doors that had once welcomed him closed firmly against his return, invitations were quietly withdrawn, and within a fortnight, whispers suggested he had left the city entirely, retreating to some distant corner of the country where his ruined reputation might not follow quite so relentlessly. Evangeline felt a quiet satisfaction whenever she heard such news, knowing that his ability to harm other young women had been permanently ended by the courage of those who had finally spoken the truth against him. Miss Alderton, freed at last from the burden of her secret, found herself embraced warmly by society rather than shunned as she had long feared, her honesty in coming forward earning her admiration rather than scorn. Her engagement proceeded as planned, her intended husband proving every bit as understanding and supportive as she had hoped once the full truth of her earlier ordeal became known to him. For Evangeline, the weeks following the confrontation passed in a happy blur of wedding preparations, as she and Alistair moved forward with plans for a future neither of them could have imagined possible only a few short months earlier. Her family, initially startled by the suddenness of the engagement, quickly grew delighted once they understood the depth of feeling that had grown between the couple through their shared trials, and preparations for a grand wedding began in earnest. Yet even amid the joy of this new chapter, Evangeline found herself reflecting often on how differently the entire affair might have unfolded, had she simply dismissed Alistair's warning that first evening as nothing more than an odd whim, or had she never found the courage to trust him despite her initial confusion and doubt. "Do you ever wonder," she asked him one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens of his family estate, the wedding now only weeks away, "what might have happened if I had simply left the ball that night as you asked, without ever learning the truth of what Marchant intended?" Alistair considered the question thoughtfully as they strolled along the winding garden path, the late summer sun warm upon their shoulders. "I suspect he would have simply chosen another target, someone perhaps less fortunate in finding allies willing to help expose his true nature. Your courage in facing the danger directly, rather than simply fleeing from it, ultimately helped protect not only yourself, but likely prevented harm to countless other women he might have targeted in years to come." "I could not have done any of it without you," Evangeline said softly, slipping her hand into his as they walked. "Your warning, however cryptic it seemed at first, set everything else in motion, and your steady support throughout every difficult step that followed gave me the courage to see it through to the end." "We faced it together," Alistair corrected gently, bringing her hand to his lips for a tender kiss. "As I hope we shall face everything else life brings our way, from this day forward." They paused near a small fountain at the center of the garden, water trickling softly over smooth stones, birds singing in the branches overhead, the peaceful scene a stark contrast to the danger and tension that had defined their courtship's dramatic beginning. Evangeline turned to face him fully, studying the familiar lines of his face that had once seemed so cold and distant, now warm with open affection whenever his eyes met hers. "I confess," she said, a small smile playing at her lips, "that I never imagined our story might begin with such a strange and frightening warning, whispered in the middle of a crowded ballroom." Alistair laughed softly, the sound rich and warm, so different from the careful composure he had once maintained so rigidly before her. "Nor did I imagine that such a warning might eventually lead me to the great fortune of winning your heart. Though I confess, watching you dance with Marchant that evening, believing for a terrible moment that my warning had gone entirely unheeded, remains among the most difficult memories of my life. You were jealous, Evangeline teased gently, delighting in the faint color that rose to his cheeks at her observation. I was terrified, he corrected, though his tone remained light despite the honesty of his admission. Terrified that I had failed to protect you, and equally terrified by the sudden, overwhelming realization of just how deeply I had come to care for you, long before I had ever allowed myself to acknowledge such feelings even to myself. Evangeline reached up to gently touch his face, her heart full with love for this man who had once seemed so unreachable, so guarded against the world, yet who had revealed himself to be capable of such fierce loyalty and tender devotion once his true feelings had finally been allowed to surface. I am glad in the end that everything unfolded exactly as it did, she said softly. Though it began in fear and danger, it led us here to this moment, and I would not trade that outcome for any simpler beginning. Their wedding, when it finally arrived on a bright autumn morning, drew nearly all of society to witness the joining of two families whose courtship had become, by then, something of a celebrated tale, whispered admiringly among the very same circles that had once buzzed with scandal over Marchant's exposed schemes. Lady Pemberton attended with obvious pride, having played such a crucial role in bringing the couple together through her willingness to help uncover the truth. Miss Alderton attended as well, radiant with her own happiness, grateful beyond words for the courage Evangeline and Alastair had shown in helping expose the man who had once threatened to destroy her future entirely. As Evangeline walked down the aisle toward Alastair, resplendent in his formal wedding attire, his eyes bright with unmistakable joy and adoration, she found herself thinking once more of that fateful whispered warning that had begun everything between them. Leave before midnight, he had said, urgent and afraid, though he had offered no explanation at the time for his sudden concern. She had defied that warning, staying past midnight out of stubborn pride, and in doing so had unknowingly set in motion the very events that would eventually reveal the depth of his devotion to her safety and happiness. Perhaps, she reflected as she reached his side and took his offered hand, some warnings were meant not simply to be obeyed without question, but to open a door toward understanding and connection that might never have been discovered otherwise. Had she simply left as instructed that first evening, she might never have witnessed Alastair's obvious distress upon finding her with Marchant, might never have learned the full truth of his growing feelings for her, might never have embarked upon the shared journey of courage and trust that had ultimately brought them to this joyful moment, surrounded by friends and family, ready to begin their life together as husband and wife. The ceremony proceeded with quiet elegance, vows exchanged with genuine emotion rather than mere formal obligation, both Evangeline and Alastair clearly moved by the significance of the promises they made to one another before their assembled guests. When at last the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, a warm cheer rose from the gathered crowd, genuine happiness for a couple whose courtship had overcome such unusual and dangerous obstacles to reach this triumphant conclusion. At the wedding breakfast that followed, Lady Pemberton approached the newly married couple with obvious satisfaction shining in her expression. I must say, she remarked warmly, I have rarely witnessed a courtship quite so dramatic, nor one that ended quite so happily. You two have found something truly special together, forged through genuine trust and shared courage, rather than mere convenient circumstance. We owe you a great debt of gratitude, Margaret, Alastair said sincerely, for your invaluable help in exposing Marchant's true nature, and for bringing Evangeline and myself together through that difficult process. Nonsense, Lady Pemberton replied, waving away his gratitude with characteristic modesty. I merely provided a few useful connections. The true courage belonged entirely to the two of you, along with Miss Alderton and the other brave women who finally found the strength to speak their truth after so long remaining silent. As the celebration continued through the afternoon, Evangeline found a quiet moment to step away from the festivities, drawn toward a peaceful corner of the estate's expansive gardens, where she might catch her breath amid the joyful chaos of her wedding day. Alistair found her there shortly after, his expression soft with contentment as he joined her beside a blooming rose bed, remarkably similar to the one where she had been cutting flowers the very day he had first come to explain the true nature of his warning weeks earlier. "Regretting the quiet life you might have led, had you simply heeded my warning and avoided this entire dramatic affair?" he asked teasingly, slipping an arm around her waist as they stood together admiring the garden's beauty. "Never," Evangeline replied firmly, leaning into his embrace with complete contentment. "Whatever danger and difficulty we faced along the way, it led us here, to a happiness I could never have imagined possible before that strange whispered warning first changed the course of my entire life. Nor could I have imagined that evening at the ball, watching you dance with another man and fearing I had lost any chance of winning your heart, that we might eventually find ourselves here, married and beginning our life together," Alistair said softly, pressing a tender kiss to her temple. "I love you, Evangeline, more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." "And I love you," Evangeline replied, turning in his arms to meet his eyes fully, warmth and certainty shining clearly in her expression. "Truly and completely, for the man you revealed yourself to be through every difficult step of our journey together. From that first frightened warning through every challenge we faced and overcame side by side." They remained together in the quiet garden a while longer, content simply to enjoy each other's company away from the celebration's bustle, before finally returning hand in hand to rejoin their guests, ready to begin the next chapter of their story together, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as partners, bound together by a love that had been tested and proven true through danger, courage, and unwavering devotion. A love that had truly begun the moment a duke's urgent whisper had first disrupted a glittering ballroom, setting in motion a chain of events that would forever change both their lives, leading them at last to this bright autumn day, and to the joyful beginning of a marriage built upon the strongest possible foundation, trust earned through adversity, faced always together, never apart. A year had passed since the wedding, and the estate that now belonged jointly to Evangeline and Alistair had grown into a home filled with warmth and laughter, quite unlike the cold and formal household Alistair had once known during his solitary years as a bachelor duke. Evangeline had taken to her new role with the same courage and determination she had shown throughout their courtship, quickly earning the respect and affection of the estate staff and tenants alike through her genuine kindness and willingness to involve herself directly in matters of their welfare. It was during this second autumn of their marriage that a letter arrived one morning, addressed to Alistair in a hand neither of them immediately recognized. He opened it at the breakfast table, his expression growing troubled as he read, prompting Evangeline to set aside her own correspondence and watch him with growing concern. "What is it?" she asked, once his silence had stretched long enough to worry her. "A letter from a colleague in the north," Alistair said slowly, setting the paper down. "It seems there have been whispers of a similar scheme unfolding there, targeting young women of good family in much the same manner Marchant once did. My colleague wondered whether I might have insight into how such matters had been handled here in London, given what became known of our efforts against Marchant." Evangeline felt a familiar mixture of concern and resolve settle over her, memories of their own dangerous investigation returning vividly despite the year that had passed since those difficult weeks. "Do you believe it could be connected to Marchant somehow? Perhaps an associate continuing his methods in his absence?" "It is possible," Alistair admitted. "Or perhaps simply another individual who learned similar techniques through observation, recognizing the same vulnerabilities in how society handles matters of reputation and scandal. Either way, it seems our experience may prove useful in helping address this new threat before it can cause similar harm." Without hesitation, Evangeline reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "Then we must write back immediately, offering whatever guidance we can. If our own difficult journey can help spare even a single young woman from the suffering Miss Alderton and the others endured, then it will have served a purpose beyond our own happiness." Over the following weeks, Alastair and Evangeline corresponded extensively with their colleague in the north, sharing the methods they had used to gather testimony, the importance of careful documentation, and the value of finding allies willing to stand publicly against such schemes despite the risk of scandal. Their guidance proved instrumental in exposing the northern scheme within a matter of months, sparing several young women from the fate that had once nearly befallen Evangeline herself. Lady Pemberton, upon hearing of their continued efforts, wrote to express her pride in how the couple had transformed their own painful experience into a force for protecting others. "You have both shown remarkable character," she wrote, "in choosing to continue this work rather than simply retreating into private happiness once your own safety was secured. Society is fortunate to have such champions within its ranks." Miss Alderton, now happily married and expecting her first child, visited the estate that winter, bringing with her a warmth and confidence that stood in stark contrast to the fearful, guarded young woman Evangeline had first met in Lady Pemberton's parlor. Their friendship had deepened considerably over the past year, bonded by shared experience and mutual respect, and Evangeline found genuine joy in witnessing how thoroughly her friend had healed from the ordeal that had once threatened to define her entire future. "I still think of that evening at Lord Ashcombe's estate," Miss Alderton confided one afternoon, as she and Evangeline sat together in the drawing-room, watching snow fall gently outside the tall windows. "I was so terrified to speak the truth publicly, certain it would ruin whatever small chance at happiness remained to me. Instead, it opened the door to everything good that has followed since." "Courage rarely feels like courage in the moment," Evangeline said thoughtfully, remembering her own fear during those difficult weeks of investigation and confrontation. "It simply feels like fear, faced despite every instinct urging retreat. Only afterward does it reveal itself as something braver than we realized ourselves capable of at the time." As winter gave way to spring, Evangeline discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled the household with fresh joy and anticipation. Alastair's careful, protective nature, once directed toward shielding her from external danger, now extended toward this new life growing within her, his devotion evident in every small gesture of attention and care throughout the months that followed. Their daughter arrived on a warm summer morning, healthy and strong, with her mother's determined spirit already evident in her lusty cries and her father's watchful, careful eyes. They named her Charlotte, in honor of Evangeline's dear friend who had stood beside her through the earliest days of the mystery that had eventually brought Evangeline and Alastair together, and who continued to remain a cherished presence in both their lives. Watching Alastair hold their newborn daughter for the first time, his expression soft with wonder and overwhelming love, Evangeline felt the full circle of their journey complete itself in this quiet, precious moment. From that first frightened whisper in a crowded ballroom, through danger and investigation and public confrontation, to this peaceful nursery filled with the soft sounds of their daughter's first cries, their story had traveled a path neither of them could have anticipated, yet one that had led them, ultimately, to exactly where they were always meant to be. "She has your courage already," Alastair murmured, gently rocking their daughter as she settled into peaceful sleep against his chest. "I can see it in the strength of her grip, the determination in her small frown." "And your careful, protective heart," Evangeline added softly, watching the tender scene before her with overwhelming love for both her husband and their new daughter. She could not ask for a better father to guide and protect her as she grows. Years later, when Charlotte was old enough to ask about how her parents had first met, Evangeline would tell the story carefully, choosing which details to share and which to save for a later age, but always emphasizing the same central truth that had defined their entire journey together. Sometimes, she would explain, the most frightening moments in life lead us toward the greatest happiness, provided we have the courage to face them honestly, and the wisdom to trust those who prove themselves worthy of that trust through their actions rather than mere words. Alastair, listening from the doorway as Evangeline shared this abbreviated version of their story with their curious daughter, felt his heart swell with the same deep love and gratitude that had guided him through every difficult moment since that fateful evening at the ball. He thought of how close he had come to losing everything, watching Evangeline dance with Marchant that terrible night, believing his warning had gone unheeded, and his feelings would forever remain unspoken. He thought of the courage she had shown throughout their investigation, the trust she had placed in him despite every reason for doubt, the love that had grown steadily between them through shared danger and eventual triumph. Their story, born from an urgent whispered warning and nearly derailed by jealousy and misunderstanding in a candlelit room, had ultimately become something far greater than either of them could have imagined that first fateful evening. It had become a testament to the power of trust freely given, courage found in the face of genuine fear, and love strong enough to weather danger, doubt, and the careful schemes of those who sought to exploit the vulnerabilities of good and honest people. As the years continued to unfold, bringing further joys and challenges in equal measure, Evangeline and Alistair faced each new chapter of their life together with the same partnership and mutual devotion that had first been forged during those dangerous, uncertain weeks following that whispered warning at the ball. Their marriage stood as living proof that even the most frightening beginnings could blossom into lasting happiness, provided both partners remained willing to face difficulty honestly, to trust one another completely, and to choose courage over fear whenever life demanded such a choice. And though society would continue, for years afterward, to whisper admiringly of the dramatic courtship between the Duke of Reburn and his Duchess, none among those who told the tale could ever quite capture the full truth of what had passed between them during those critical weeks. The fear and uncertainty, the growing trust and deepening love, the courage required to face danger directly rather than retreat into comfortable ignorance. Only Evangeline and Alistair themselves truly understood the complete journey that had brought them together, a journey that had begun with 4 simple words whispered urgently in a crowded ballroom, and had ended, not truly ended at all, but rather transformed into a lifetime of shared happiness, built upon the strongest foundation 2 people could ever hope to share, a foundation of trust, courage, and enduring love that had proven itself worthy through every trial they had faced, and would continue to face, always together, side by side, for as long as they both should live.